everyone. This is the first of two wrap-up videos talking about my reading year in 2025. This one I'm talking about, as the title says, some of my new favorites, some things that did not meet my expectations, and unfortunately a couple big disappointments for the year. But the big wrap-up video is going to be hopefully next week, assuming everything goes right with filming and editing, and that is the 5th annual Red Fury Book Awards, where I put up the green screen, don the tuxedo, and do an awards show for everything that I read in 2025. I'm especially excited this year that I do have 6 or 7 guest presenters for that video. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm also going to release it a little later in the day than I normally do, and I'm going to release it as a premiere so that hopefully a lot of us will watch it together. I'll hang out in the chat as well. Push it a little later for those of you that might be like West Coast USA and not want to have to get up at like 6 a.m. when I normally post my videos. But anyway, look for that next week. Fingers crossed that everything goes well in the filming and editing of that video. But here we go. Let's talk about 2025. So I'm going to just start with a little bit of an overview before I start gushing about my new favorites this year. So I read 109 books in 2025. I did have 3 DNFs, which is tied for the most of any year for me. That's a lot for me to DNF 3 books. My average rating, according to GOODREADS, is 4.15. I reread 8 books this year, which I'm going to continue to do that, maybe even a little bit more next year. This year, I set my record by doubling the amount of audiobooks that I usually listen to. Most years, I listen to between 10 and 14 audiobooks. This year, I read 23 books listening to them, so 23 audiobooks this year. My largest book that I read was Shadows Upon Time by Christopher Rocchio. That was 1,383 pages. And the smallest book I read was The Strange Library, which is 96 pages. That's Haruki Murakami's novella. So the number of books, that averages about 9 books per month. My highest total for a month was June, in which I read 14 books, mostly aided by the fact that I don't work the month of June. I'm off for the summer, so I do have the entire month of June off. It's a big reading month for me, and it's too hot to do much here in Texas in the summer. My shortest, smallest amount of books finished in a month was February, which was 6 books. Short month, very busy month for my work, and I read a book that took 14 days within that month, so that's why that total was lower. I read 13 different genres or classifications, different kinds of nonfiction books are more classifications than maybe genres. And of the top 3 kind of books that I read 46 fantasy books, I read 25 science fiction books, and 9 works of crime fiction. My top 3 authors, my top 2 were tied, both Jim Butcher and Christopher Rocchio. I read 11 things by both of them, and Guy Gavriel, I read 7 books by him. So my first new favorite from 2025 is Midnight Tides by Steven Erikson. This is the 5th book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is a 10-book series, epic fantasy, epic, capital E, capital P, you get the gist. It's a huge series. And what is so interesting about this book, this is the 5th book in the series, and it's almost a new beginning. The Malazan Book of the Fallen talks about a global conflict. And just as if you were telling the story of World War II, you wouldn't be kind of chronological through the books. You would probably focus on different areas. You might do Europe, you may do North Africa, you may do Asia, however you want to do that. Well, in this series, the 1st and 3rd books were on one continent, the 2nd and 4th books were on another continent, and this was a new introduction, and it was a big starting over because just about all of the characters in this book were brand new. The location, the people, the cultures, even the gods that were kind of behind the scenes were different in this book. And I loved it. This was, I think, objectively, of the 7 books that I've read so far in this series, I think it was the tightest narrative, and I think it was just the easiest to kind of digest beginning to end. It didn't seem like it had any slow moments like some of the other Malazan books, even though a lot of them I do consider favorites as well. It had more humor than anything that Erikson had written up to in this series. It has some of my favorite characters that you just meet for the first time. Well, Midnight Tides, again, I'm through 7 books as I'm filming this in this series, and this is my favorite. And we'll see. Everybody seems to say that the last book is their favorite in the series, so we'll see if this is relegated to 2nd place or even 4th place. I have 3 more books in the series, but 2025, I read Midnight Tides, and it was an instant favorite for me. So my second favorite from 2025 is a book series by Daniel Abraham called The Long Price Quartet. And this is not epic fantasy, although it is fantasy genre. This is actually the first two books, the first half of this quartet of books. Each of these books are 250 to 300 pages, and the one thing I learned so much from it is that with a great author, you don't need to have hundreds of pages to still do a lot of the great things within the fantasy genre that a lot of the other authors do. Daniel Abraham, in particular, two areas of just mastery that he demonstrates in this series are the world building, despite its length, despite its small length. I mean, all four of these books are probably like 1.5 books of the Wheel of Time or Stormlight Archive or something like that. The whole series is done in that amount of time, but he doesn't sacrifice really great world building. And additionally, the characterization here is something special. One unique facet of this quartet of novels is that you get to meet some characters in the first book, and then over the course of the 4 years, 4 books, you get time jumps between the books and 10 to 15 year time jumps between the books. So you meet two young boys at the beginning of the prelude, the prologue of the first book, and then by the end of the last book, they're old men, and you get to see them in various stages of their lives. And it's incredible how well developed these characters are, that Abraham himself did kind of all of the work in between the books, and then he presents it so well for you, how each book builds upon all of these characters' different personality traits, how it influences their futures, and it all feels so real. Additionally, the characters in this series, they feel like people. They don't feel like characters on the page. They feel realistic. They feel like people that you know, people that you may love, that also frustrate you, people that will bring you the greatest joy and the greatest sadness. They are just so real, and I went through just the gamut of emotions with so many of the different characters in this series. And some of the secondary characters you see in different installments, but the two main characters that you get at the very beginning, we see them all the way to the end of the series. It's a really remarkable series. In our corner of BookTube, we've heard Alan from the Library of Alexandria just rave about this book series for years, and he's right. It is one of the best. I realized when I was thinking about this book series, I've never done a top 10 fantasy list on my channel, so I might have to do one of those next year, but there's zero doubt in my mind that the Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham is on that top 10, and just see how high it is in that top 10 of fantasy that I've ever read. It's fantastic. I would urge you to go pick up the first book, and I hope you love it as I do, and I will give you a pose of thank you if you do pick it up. If you know, you know. Another book series that became a new favorite for me in 2025 is the Cartel trilogy by Don Winslow, which begins with The Power of the Dog. The second book is called The Cartel. The third book is called The Border. And this series is kind of epic length crime fiction. And it's epic not just in length, that they're pretty thick books, but also in just the detail and kind of the scope of everything. A lot of time in crime fiction, you get a lot of stories that are more personal. You may get like a police procedural or a legal thriller that follows us one case or two cases or just a small cast of characters. This is a sprawling story about a DEA agent who is fighting the cartels in Mexico. And you see at the very beginning of the series, much like Long Price Quartet, you get to know this character through several decades and in this big war against the cartels. The level of detail is remarkable. There's several times when I was reading this trilogy that I thought I was reading nonfiction because it just felt so real because of that level of detail that Winslow gets in there. Now, these books are brutal. These are not for the faint of heart. There are some extremely violent things that happen in all three of these books, including one that I wish I could forget. It's like that brutal. But if you're not turned off by that kind of just abject violence that you're going to sometimes get in this genre, this series is incredible. The storytelling is just remarkable. And having read 6 works by this author now, I'm really impressed with his scope because these feel different than the other 3 works of his that I've read. It feels just like a magnum opus portion of his career. We'll see when I get through everything that I've read by him. But The Power of the Dog, The Cartel, The Border, just masterworks within the genre of crime fiction. 2025 marks the year that I proclaim that The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher is a favorite series of mine. So this is a series that I went back and forth on. There were 3 different times I kind of almost jumped off the series and DNF'd and didn't continue. But I pushed through because the overall trajectory of the series did keep going up. I did a tier list of this earlier this year, and it's spoiler free if you want to check that out and just kind of see the ebb and flow of the series from my perspective. Feel free to check out that video. But as far as the Dresden Files is concerned, it's an urban fantasy, and it follows a character named Harry Dresden, and he's a wizard in Chicago. So it's in our world. But what's really cool about this series for me, the thing that I loved about it, and the thing that pulled me back the most when I was having those moments of doubt in this series, was the world building. The series starts off with kind of the monster of the week type of thing, and we get a story that's self-contained. And what you start to see, though, is that Butcher is layering the different stories on top of each other. So, like, the third book has to do with vampires, and there's the fairy courts, and then we get a later book, we get the White Council of Wizards. It's all layering in there, and at a certain point, you just realize that he's created a really intricate and vast universe, and he's just kind of led you along in different ways to show you what it's all about. And that's something that really kept me going right away. Even when I wanted to DNF the first book, I kept thinking, I want to know more about this White Council of Wizards, and it was enough to keep me going. The other thing that's really been impressive through this series is the characterization. Harry is frustrating. There's times I can't stand him, but he has a great heart, and he always wants to do well. And his journey, you see growth. You see some ebb and flow with him as well, but you see just what he was at the beginning and what he's become through 17 books. It's a really great character arc. But even beyond that, the secondary characters in this series are just tremendously drawn. And I appreciate that Butcher doesn't always include them in each book. Sometimes he leaves off a secondary character for a book or a few books in a row if they're not integral to the story. But you start to see their character growth, and some of the secondary characters, by the time I got late in the series, I just loved them, maybe even more than Harry himself. So the series as a whole, it's bumpy, it's rocky, it starts rough. There's some moments in there that made me want to quit the series, but overall, I'm really a favorite. It's a favorite of mine, and I can't wait till the new one comes out. It's the first time I'll be reading a new Dresden book with everybody else when 12 Months comes out, I think a few days after this video is released. So 2025 is a momentous year in many ways, and this last one might be the biggest for me personally. For the last 20, 30 years, I don't know an exact date, I've always had this sentence end a certain way, and the sentence was, my favorite author is, and for 20 or 30 years, it's always ended with Stephen King. Well, for the first time in that span, my favorite author is not Stephen King. He's been bumped to number 2 by Guy Gavriel Kay. Guy Gavriel Kay is a Canadian fantasy author who does storytelling in a different manner. I've gushed about him earlier in the year. I did 2 videos I would love for you to check out. One was an overview and reading advice of Kay's works, of his 16 novels, and then I did a really fun tier ranking list with Bridger from the Library Ladder and Jake Bishop, where we kind of negotiated and came up with our consensus tier ranking for the 16 works of Guy Gavriel Kay. I think he's the greatest fantasy author out there, and he's become my favorite author. There are so many things I can say about this author, about why I love his work so much. I mean, I can talk about intricate plotting, how not a single one of his books ever felt slow. I could talk about how great his characterization is, although I never consider him a character writer. He can often take a secondary character that you see in one of these books, you see a secondary character for 7 pages, that I felt had more depth than protagonists of entire novels. I could gush about that. I could gush about his theming, which just hits me close, the themes of nostalgia or memory or remembrance. I mean, those kinds of things really, really get me. Characters that learn, characters that grow. We could talk about that. We could talk about his world building, and maybe we should talk about that, because a lot of fantasy authors or readers consider this more historical fiction than fantasy, because he takes his inspiration in kind of our past, and he tells a story oftentimes highly influenced by an event in the past. So, like the Cathar Crusades influenced the Song of Arbonne. And I could talk about all those things, but I'm going to talk about kind of two things intertwined, even though I guess I cheated and talked about all those things. I think as a writer, I think he's gifted as much as anybody that I've read, not just in this genre. I think his writing is so beautiful. It's so poetic, so lyrical, but it's not flowery purple prose just for the sake of flowery purple prose. It's just the most perfectly balanced writing style from a detailed line, paragraph lens. I think he is unmatched in that. But intertwined with that, especially as he got further in his career, this writing style, coupled with the theming and the stories that he told, for me, he developed a narrative voice that caused me to feel something in his books that I haven't felt anywhere else. When I read just the best of Guy Gavriel's works, which is about half of them, when I read the best of his works, I feel like I'm reading something important. And I don't know many other authors that have ever made me feel that. I've read books that this is a great story, or maybe this individual story feels important, or I'm loving this book, but I've rarely felt so often with a single author where I'm reading a book and I'm feeling like this is important. And it's because of that strong narrative voice from an historical lens that's telling these stories from afar and making you realize how important they are. That strong narrative voice, coupled with his just supreme command of the English language, has just vaulted this guy into the upper echelon of my love of reading. And Guy Gavriel has become my favorite author. So as of 2025, to say the full sentence, my favorite author is Guy Gavriel. Okay, so the next category of this video, much shorter, there's only two of these here. These are two works that I had very high expectations for, and unfortunately they didn't meet those expectations. Now, you could say that's on me, and you'd be 100% right, but I don't know how realistic it is to go into any work with zero expectations. When people recommend things to you, you read a review, you read something about them, people say specifically, you're going to love this book, or you see a list and this is the best of this kind of book ever. I find it really hard to go in with zero expectations. I try my best, but at least in these two I failed because I went in with high expectations, and while I enjoyed both of these things, they didn't meet those expectations. The first thing of Unmet Expectations is a book series, and that's Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. And I'm holding up this book because this book is the reason that this series didn't reach the heights that I had hoped. I alluded to at the beginning that a book took me 14 days to read this year, and that was this book. I think I read both volumes of Green Angel Tower to Green Angel Tower quicker than this one. This was just a total slog for me. And that's usually not an issue for me. I was told specifically by several people that I was going to love Tad Williams because of my love for two different authors, Tolkien and Hobb. Because this is kind of right in between those two authors. You get Tad Williams, who is telling these stories that are influenced by Tolkien, but he's considered maybe the bridge, or maybe him and Robert Jordan are considered the bridges between kind of the traditional kind of storytelling that we got in a lot of the Tolkien-esque fantasy and towards more modern things that we value, like deeper characterization and things like that. So I thought because of that I was going to love this series. Additionally, Hobb's books are slow. She even says that she sometimes takes a while to get to the point. But I felt the big difference in here because these books are slow as well. I found the big difference is that with Hobb, I felt that I was always getting like valuable characterization. And especially in some of her slow books, when it was a first-person narrative, you were getting a lot from that character and you were still learning and growing and things like that. And this book in particular, there was one point where I think I counted POVs and there were 10 of them, and I realized I didn't care about 9 of them. And maybe because it was jumping around so much, I didn't care so much about it. So the series as a whole, I really enjoyed because I loved the last book. To Green Angel Tower has some of the most amazing set pieces that stick with me. There's scenes in there, there's some character moments in there that I do think of periodically and have all year. So as a whole, like, I really like this series. I think it's a great series. I would consider reading it again. I do want to read the second series first. But my expectations, unfortunately, were a little bit too high and they were a little bit unmet. So, unfortunately, in my unmet expectations category, I get Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. So, my other work that is in this unmet expectations category is a memoir. And this memoir, if you Google best memoirs or top 10 memoirs, not only will this probably be on every single list that you find, it may be number one on every single list that you find. It won the Pulitzer. I mean, it's super famous and it's very good. Once again, kind of common. I liked it, but it did not become my favorites. It didn't even make my finals for like best nonfiction work of the year. And that's Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. And this had to do 100% with the ending. So the story is riveting. It's Frank McCourt telling about his upbringing in poverty-stricken Ireland, and he's telling all these stories, and it's quite amazing how well he's able to fuse just these horrible conditions and these horrible situations with humor and being positive. And I mean, I loved it. His narrative voice is like maybe the best I've ever read in this kind of book. Now, I did listen to the audiobook, and I do recommend that because it's him, and he's telling these stories. When he's singing these songs, he's singing the songs. So it's a perfect way to experience these books. But I got to the end of the audiobook, and it just kind of ends. It's like he finishes a chapter and it's done. So much so that I went to my library to get the physical book to see if the audiobook left off a chapter or two at the end, because it ended with zero closure and it just kind of, oh, we're done. And no, that was the end of the book. And I'm still just kind of flabbergasted by it. Maybe it's because I see that he wrote a sequel and he wanted people to read that. But all of these stories had such depth, and I had such a connection to him and all of his family members that I just felt it lacked closure, and it really hurt my reception of the book. And it's a shame because it's a masterpiece, but it's not what I thought it could have been. I thought it could have been like my best memoir ever, or even best of the year, and it didn't reach that height because of just the kind of, oh, I'm done with a chapter. Oh, my deadline's tomorrow. I got to turn in the book. I don't know how he decided to end it like this. I mean, there's a kind of a reason why he ended it where he did, but it didn't leave me with much closure, unfortunately. So, unfortunately, another one, I had such high hopes. I thought it was going to be my nonfiction book of the year, but alas, it's still very good. Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. All right, on to my big disappointments of the year. There are only two, and I don't talk negatively on this channel very often, so here's your opportunity, I guess. The first one may surprise you, and that's Proven Guilty by Jim Butcher, and this is the, I think, 8th book in the Dresden Files. And you're thinking, wait, didn't you just say that that's one of your favorite series now? Yes, I did. Well, Proven Guilty was the third time I almost quit the series. And the big reason why is one thing I don't like in the series and didn't like from book one. In fact, I read book one with an old book club of mine, and that was the biggest thing everybody kept talking about, and that's Harry's male gaze. So there's a spectrum with it in these books. Sometimes it's on the spectrum of, he describes a woman and you just roll your eyes and say, okay, we get it, Harry. She's gorgeous, whatever. And then he sometimes veers on the other side of the spectrum where it's uncomfortable and it's creepy. And in this book, it's just downright wrong. And I'm not talking about that horrible scene at the end of the book, which, had I not been reading Kindle, I would have literally thrown. If it would have been one of those bad mass market paperbacks, I would have thrown it. There's a scene at the end of that book that's repulsive. But even beyond that, so Harry has this male gaze, which is just amped up to 11. And when it's amped up to 11, it crosses some lines. And I felt in this book it was crossing lines. Even if you're a man who's always checking out women, you don't check out your buddy's wife. You don't check out your buddy's daughter. And it pulled me out of the narrative because I kept thinking weird things about Jim Butcher. Like, how does he think that this is okay to write this? And I also wonder why his editor didn't tell him to tone it down, because I found it repulsive. And at the end of this book, adding to those kinds of things, got this horrible scene at the end. It was the time I almost jumped off. And I talked with some people on the Discord, and they said it's toned down a lot after that, and it really has been. It's still there. And I don't mind it when it's on the spectrum that, Harry checks somebody out and describes her, if it's in the eye-rolling part. But when it borders on what's appropriate for a good human being, that's when I had trouble with it. So that book was a big disappointment for me. I did continue the series. It became a favorite, but Proven Guilty was definitely a disappointment. All right, and the biggest of big disappointments this year was Never Flinch by Stephen King. This has nothing to do with him being relegated to my number 2 favorite author of all time, but this just wasn't good. So I'm not a reader that is saying, Stephen King, stop writing crime fiction, because he's done it well. I like the Bill Hodges trilogy. I think Later was good. I think Billy Summers was good. But these last 2 books, Holly and Never Flinch, have not been good. And I'm also not a reader that's like, stop telling stories about Holly. Now, if he does say, like, if he does have a book where it's Holly Gibney Goes to Midworld or something like that, yeah, I might be flipping tables at that point. But I don't mind Holly. I liked her in the If It Bleeds novella. I liked her in Outsider. So, I mean, I like her as a character, so it has nothing to do with that character. It has to do with the king of suspense writing something that's bereft of suspense, writing a crime thriller with no thrills. I see a lot of people say they like this, but they also, frankly, don't read this genre a lot. I'm a huge fan of crime fiction. Connolly, I'm getting into Winslow, Lehane, I've read some Donald Westlake, Elmore Leonard, Stieg Larsson. I've read a lot of really good crime authors. And the one thing they do really well is they plot things really well. And they keep the tension high. King's usually good at that second part, but here he wasn't. This book had no suspense. I knew early on how it was going to end, and I felt no sense of peril for anybody. And it just made it a really, really dull reading experience. And it kind of made me sad, honestly, because I kept reading it thinking, has King lost his fastball? Is he ever going to write a great book again? Because the last 2, well, the last 3, if you include Fairy Tale in there, which had a disappointing turn in the middle, he hasn't written a great Stephen King book in quite a while. So this was my biggest disappointment. I don't want to rant. I could rant longer on this, but I'm going to stop. But I think he's writing The Talisman 3. I hope that it's a return to form and he knocks it out of the park. And I love that one because I do still love Stephen King. I'm doing 2 reading projects around his work at the moment, and I want to continue to love him and hope that the next thing he puts out is not a big disappointment like Never Flinch. Well, I hated to end on a negative, but that's how I structured this video. But only 2 big disappointments for the year. Not a bad year all in all. So I'd love to hear your answers to these 3 things. If you have any new favorites, if you have any things that did not meet your expectations, or if you had any big disappointments in your reading year, let me know in the comments section below. And if you want to talk about any of these, I'd love to talk with you down there as well. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.